We simply cannot allow people to pour into the United States undetected, undocumented, unchecked.
And complete the dang fence.
This bill that we will sign today is not a revolutionary bill.
Cast down your bucket where you are.
We come from France.
And I am, adamantly against illegal immigrants.
They're coming in by the thousands, just unbelievable.
A wall is an immorality.
Who are you rooting for?
Those masters of the universe are at it again.
They're not sending their best.
You maniac! You blew it up!
Welcome to Parsing Immigration Policy, the podcast of the Center for Immigration Studies. This is Mark Krikorian, Executive Director of the Center. And today we have with us someone who's been involved in the immigration issue for many years. Kris Kobach is the 45th Attorney General of the state of Kansas. He has been in that position since 2023. Before that, he's had other positions. He was Secretary of State of Kansas, also worked as an attorney at the Department of Justice in Washington. Has kind of almost, don't take this the wrong way, Kris, but almost a ridiculous resume. Harvard, Yale Law, and Oxford PhD. I mean, I don't know what's left. MIT? Anyway, so thanks for joining us, Kris. And just to be clear, Attorney General in Kansas is an elected position, right? So you're kind of your own, you're not appointed by the governor or anything like that.
That's correct. Yeah, it's elected in Kansas. It's elected in almost all of the states. There are a few states that appoint them. Yeah, there's I think it's 3 states that the governor appoints the AG. There's 1 state where the Supreme Court appoints the AG, but virtually all of the others are elected independent officers. And and in Kansas, for example, we have a Democrat governor at the moment, and I've sued the governor for her failure to enforce and or abide by a specific law. So yeah, it's an independent office.
So that means, of course, you've made your own promises, you have your own priorities, and among them, there's a lot of things that an attorney general in a state does, but immigration is one of the things that you would be dealing with. And while people don't necessarily think of Kansas as a big immigration state, I mean, it's more, sort of Wizard of Oz is kind of what people think of, and cornfields, but obviously it's a big state, and there are immigration issues. Immigrants are now everywhere. Every state is a border state at this point. And you've been involved in the issue for a long time. And so maybe I'll just start with enforcement type issues. What is the state of cooperation in law enforcement in Kansas with ICE, with federal immigration authorities?
Well, it's very good right now. And, looking at Kansas in terms of the illegal immigration picture, these are all estimates. And Mark, as you know, we don't have a firm number. But, it's generally estimated that somewhere around 90,000, perhaps 100,000 illegal aliens reside in Kansas. We are a destination state. The meatpacking industry in the past has had a significant number of illegal aliens, although they have moved more toward legal refugee aliens more recently. But of course, the construction industries, the KC metro area is a metro area of about 3 million people. Large number of illegal aliens head that way. And of course, we have highways crisscrossing the state right in the middle of the country. So we're also a pass-through state, and many illegal aliens are encountered on our highways on their way to other places.
Right.
So, but in terms of enforcement, law enforcement cooperation, that's something that I have really been pushing as the chief law enforcement officer of the state. And Kansas and Texas were the first 2 states, once President Bush took office, first 2 states to sign statewide 287G agreements. In other words, agreements where a state agency, in my case, the Kansas Bureau of Investigation, which is under my leadership,
right,
we have officers being trained with 287G authority, which I'm sure many of your listeners know is authority where the officer is essentially deputized with ICE powers, so to speak. You have the ability to tap into ICE databases. You can initiate removal proceedings. You can determine someone's status, do all kinds of things that it's very helpful for ICE if local law enforcement has these abilities too. So Kansas got one of these agreements signed right out of the gate, and we are pushing sheriff's offices in our 105 counties to do the same at the sheriff level. The bottom line, Mark, ICE has, depending on how you count them, roughly 15,000 officers who are personnel engaged in, investigating and deporting illegal aliens. And even that's a slightly higher number because that counts all of the HSI investigators.
Sure.
that's just not enough people to undertake what President Trump has described as the largest deportation effort since President Eisenhower. This is a big country. The number of illegal aliens, of course, we all know is in the tens of millions. And even if you doubled ICE's size, which is one of the objectives of the bill pending in Congress, that's still not even close to enough. And it would take years to recruit and train those officers. So we need law enforcement officers right now to engage in this deportation and removal effort. And that's where 287G comes in. We have so many local law enforcement who are actually making regular contact with illegal aliens. As many people know, ICE doesn't really just patrol around like a normal law enforcement agency looking for illegal aliens. They launch investigations, they follow leads. But local law enforcement catches, throws a net out every day in the form of traffic stops. And these traffic stops will bring in all kinds of people who are wanted for crimes and who are also illegal aliens. And when you have that massive eyes and ears effect of, just seeing so many hundreds of thousands or millions of people in law enforcement encounters like that every day, and the illegal aliens can be extracted from that massive number of people, that's where the real potential is to bring success to Trump's effort. So that's one thing I'm leading right now. And as you know, Mark, way back when I was working for Attorney General John Ashcroft at the Justice Department more than 20 years ago, I was involved in getting the very first 287G agreement signed between the federal government and the state of Florida. And so it's something that I believed for many years is a key to successful removal efforts.
Are the state troopers in Kansas under your authority too? Is that part of the thing?
They are not under my authority. They're under the governor's authority in Kansas.
So, but I mean, what I was going to say is, are there 287G agreements with other agencies other than just your Kansas Bureau of Investigation?
There are ones that will be signed with sheriff's offices around the state. And it's possible that the Highway Patrol may sign one. But, at this point, as long as we have one statewide agency that can coordinate these efforts and local agencies can then say, hey, can you take custody of this illegal alien? Can you check this person? That gives us a huge leap forward in assisting ICE with this removal effort. So it's a big deal.
On our sanctuary city map, I don't know if you're familiar with it, but Jessica Vaughn, whom you know on our staff, maintains our sanctuary city map. There's a Douglas County in Kansas is listed as in non-cooperative in a jail policy. This comes from ICE's own information. Are you familiar with that? Is that something you would get involved with one way or another?
Yeah, we are familiar with the fact that Douglas County has been listed. That's, of course, where Kansas University is. It's college town with the type of politics you usually see in a college town. But we are looking at that to see, as you know, in 1996, Congress passed a law that prohibits sanctuary cities, but it didn't have any teeth to it. It just says you can't, stop communication between ICE and then it was the INS and local law enforcement. It's fairly narrow. We're trying to determine if there's any violation of that federal statute. There's also a Kansas state law against sanctuary cities, but it too is unfortunately pretty narrow. So we are actually investigating that fact pattern right now.
One of the other things you've been involved with, and this is when you're in private practice and then also as Attorney General, is suing the federal government for its violations of immigration law. And wasn't one thing that you were involved with was one of the first DACA lawsuits? That was when you were when you were not in government?
Yeah, that's right. Actually, as you know, the first announcement of DACA was in June of 2012. Barack Obama was using the issue, which he previously said he had no ability to offer some sort of quasi-amnesty to these individuals who, allegedly came into the country as a minor. Then all of a sudden he announces, or his Homeland Security Secretary, Janet Napolitano, announces, hey, we can do this. I brought the first lawsuit. I was the attorney who brought the lawsuit on behalf of 10 ICE agents. And we got a preliminary injunction ruling out of the Northern District of Texas federal court. The case later went to the Fifth Circuit, and I think the Fifth Circuit incorrectly decided that the ICE officers didn't have standing when clearly they did. But that ruling from Judge O'Connor in the Northern District of Texas was later used by the state of Texas, which clearly did have standing. And so they looked at the precedent on the merits and said, look, Judge O'Connor's reasoning is correct. And Texas was able to use that in a subsequent lawsuit to challenge DACA. And, amazingly, that litigation continues when anyone looking at it can see clearly that DACA is illegal under federal statute. It's an effort to do an end run around statute. So yes, I represented the ICE agents. Then later in private practice, I represented Texas sheriffs suing the Biden administration because the Biden administration was violating federal statute when it had these new guidelines that basically said whole swaths of the vast majority of illegal aliens were no longer eligible to be deported, even though federal law says certain categories shall be deported.
Right.
Federal law prioritizes and says you must deport one of these categories of illegal aliens if you come across them. So there was a direct conflict. So I brought that lawsuit. And then most recently, I led a multi-state coalition of red state attorneys general suing the Biden administration in the final year of the Biden administration regarding their regulation to give Obamacare benefits to DACA aliens and to other illegal aliens, something that is in violation of the Obamacare or Affordable Care Act itself, and is also in violation of the 1996 Welfare Reform Act, which says that illegal aliens cannot receive federal public benefits as well as state public benefits. So I argued that case myself. We brought the case in the District of North Dakota, and we won. And then the Eighth Circuit did an initial review of a stay application from the Biden administration and ruled in our favor as well. So yeah, I've been litigating against lawless presidents on the immigration issue for quite some time.
Yep. That's the role that a lot of attorneys general play, and it's a feature of our federal system that at least there's some kind of counterweight when the executive tries to go rogue like that. Any future lawsuits planned? I mean, obviously the administration now is definitely in favor of immigration enforcement, but anything else you have your eye on? Because there are some things that the administration almost might want to be sued on in some sense. Any plans?
Well, actually, there's one that we've already filed, and Kansas is leading this lawsuit as well. Filed it in the Northern District of Louisiana. And this one is not about removing illegal aliens. It's about counting illegal aliens in the census. This is one of those holy grails of the law, a question that has never been answered by the Supreme Court, but it is very difficult to have a legal quest that actually gets the question answered. And of course, it has to do with the 14th Amendment, which requires that the whole number of persons residing in the United States be counted every 10 years, and that we then apportion congressional seats and electoral votes on that count. Well, as you know, Mark, for more than 50 years, the United States government has been counting all warm bodies in a state, and that includes illegal aliens. It also includes temporary aliens.
Right.
Now, the words of the 14th Amendment were originally based on the Civil Rights Act of 1866, and the Civil Rights Act of 1866 expresses that, no, you're supposed to be counting inhabitants, people who actually live in the country. So the argument is that this is contrary to the understanding of the 14th Amendment to be counting people who don't inhabit the United States. Clearly, someone whose presence is illegal should not be counted, and someone whose presence by law ends on a certain date in 6 months or in a year should not be counted. And because we are counting illegal aliens and temporary aliens, the state of California has at least 6 extra congressional seats that it should not have. A number of other states have lost congressional seats. And so this lawsuit is a coalition of states, not a huge coalition, but states that clearly have standing. So you have Louisiana, which is almost certain to lose a congressional seat in 2030. You have Kansas, which may possibly lose a congressional seat in 2030. You have West Virginia, which lost a seat in the last census. You also have Pennsylvania, which lost a seat, Ohio, which lost a seat. And so there's clear standing in this case. There have been past efforts over the last 40 years to bring this question to the courts, and they've all failed.
Right.
Failed because of standing.
Right.
An early one was brought by FAIR, the Federation for Immigration Reform. The district court, this was back in the 80s or 90s, a long time ago, said, well, FAIR doesn't have standing. They don't have injury as an organization. And then the state of Alabama tried to bring a lawsuit more recently, and it was declared moot when Alabama didn't end up losing the congressional seat that it anticipated. So this current coalition, though, we've got states that have already lost a seat, and we've got states that are likely to lose seats. And I think there's a very, very good chance that standing will exist, and we will finally get some rulings from federal courts on this really crucial question of how we allocate congressional seats and electoral votes in the United States. And I think the country has been violating the 14th Amendment for many, many decades.
Any ideas on when there might be news on that lawsuit? I mean, obviously these things can go on forever, but
yeah, well, in this particular lawsuit, we couldn't really ask for a preliminary injunction, which is immediate relief, because we're looking at the 2030 census and trying to have all of the changes made by then. The lawsuit's been on hold, as have a lot of lawsuits that the Trump administration has a hand on, because they're trying to determine their position. Obviously, the president would agree with the position taken by the states that it is wrong to count these individuals who are either illegally or temporarily in the United States. So that one's still in a preliminary stage. It probably, we probably won't have rulings coming down from a court for at least a year. But nevertheless, that's one to keep your eye on, because my hope is finally, we can get an appellate court and hopefully the U.S. Supreme Court to answer this critical question.
That's even more important given the past 4 years, because, for a long time, the illegal immigrant population did in fact kind of range between 10 and 12 million. People don't believe us when we say that, but that's actually true, because there's always people coming and going. Some people get legal status, whereas in the past 4 years, the illegal population has dramatically increased. And so this really will make a difference if those people are counted for purposes of apportionment.
It's a huge issue. And, not only is it contrary to the text of the 14th Amendment, but it's also about the equal weighting of votes, one person, one vote. Because let's imagine you live in some district in California where half of the people counted in that congressional district are illegal aliens. So that means that, let's just pick round numbers. Say there's 800,000 people and 400,000 are illegal aliens, versus a district in, Pennsylvania where there are 800,000 people and all 800,000 people are U.S. citizens. Those voters in Pennsylvania have half of the voting strength of a voter in that California district. So there's all kinds of constitutional problems with counting illegal aliens and counting temporary aliens.
Absolutely. And on the issue of elections, I don't want to get into the non-immigration related issues, but you were, in the first Trump administration, appointed to a commission about election integrity. I forget the exact name. What happened with that? I remember there was some controversy and it ended up, I think, being, sort of discontinued. But what happened very briefly there, and what were the issues, at least the immigration related issues there?
So it was the Presidential Commission on Election Integrity. I was the vice chairman of it. Vice President Pence was the chair, although as a practical matter, the vice chair led the commission. Yeah, we started looking at election integrity and voter fraud, and immediately the left brought a number, the usual suspects brought a number of lawsuits, a dozen lawsuits against the commission, claiming that we shouldn't have access to publicly available information like voter rolls, which are publicly available. And the lawsuits just started bogging the commission down, so many staff being involved in, providing answers to legal inquiries from the plaintiffs, that unfortunately the office of the vice president decided to end the commission due to the lawsuits. I disagreed with that decision. I think it should have continued. It was important work. And, we then saw just how important it was in the 2020 election. Although people may disagree about how much voter fraud there certainly was a lot of it. Right.
And now that's at the state level, it's the Secretary of State that deals with the elections, which was your job in the past.
And let me add one more point there, and that is that one of the things I did both as Secretary of State in Kansas and as the vice chair of the Commission on Election Integrity is look at this question of aliens on the voter rolls. It's a huge problem. It is one that the Trump administration was concerned about back then and is concerned about now. And it's an interesting problem because people often assume when they hear about this issue, they recognize that it's in all of the states except for Kansas and Arizona right now, and the Kansas law is on hold, was set aside by a court judgment. You don't have to prove your citizenship. You just check a box, sign your name. I'm a U.S. citizen.
This is when you register to vote, in other words, right?
When you register to vote, yeah. And so in Kansas, it was challenged by the ACLU in court. We had experts testifying. We likely had thousands of aliens on our voter rolls illegally. But you can't just get an exact number because you can't just look at the voter rolls and say, oh, this person's an illegal alien, this person's a legal alien, this person's a U.S. citizen. There are no indicators. And so you have to put a screen on it, a filter on it at the beginning to make sure only U.S. citizens get on the voter rolls. Anyway, that long legal battle ended with an unfavorable panel in the 10th Circuit. Supreme Court didn't take cert. There's now a case coming out of Arizona to answer this question. But the left has argued in these court cases that it's unconstitutional to ask someone to prove their citizenship.
Right, which is crazy.
Absolutely crazy. Absolutely crazy. And so that question is one that Kansas will be supporting the state of Arizona on, weighing in as this case moves on. And we are hopeful that, God willing, the Supreme Court might eventually settle the question and make it clear that a state has every right to ask a person registering to vote to prove their citizenship. And by prove it, I mean, this is really easy to do. You can show a passport, you can show a birth certificate, you can show a real ID compliant driver's license where you've established your citizenship. There are a whole bunch of other ways you can establish it. It's not a difficult thing at all.
Right. In fact, I'd argue states have a responsibility. If they're in charge of policing elections, which they have a responsibility to make sure that only U.S. citizens are voting, at least in federal elections. At the state level,
yeah, absolutely.
Some states do allow non-citizen voting, or at least in localities do, like for school district or something like that. But in federal elections, I mean, it would seem to me they're legally obliged to check that sort of thing. Should be.
There is certainly a responsibility. I mean, any system of government where only citizens are supposed to be voting may legally vote. If the government entity in charge of the elections, whether it be the county or the state, if there's no desire or effort to enforce that requirement of citizenship, that would be a pretty sad state of affairs because, as the custodians of elections, we're supposed to make sure that only eligible people are voting.
Right.
And they're only voting once. If you allow in across the country millions of ineligible voters, then you've got a problem. And every time a non-citizen votes, it cancels out the vote of a U.S. citizen.
Absolutely.
It's a big deal.
Yep.
And, people on the left talk about saving democracy. They're not interested in saving democracy in that respect or saving the value of votes by U.S. citizens. So, they only save democracy when it furthers their political beliefs.
So the last immigration thing I wanted to touch on was E-Verify. There isn't a statewide requirement for E-Verify in Kansas, but people doing business with the Attorney General and your various agencies do. How does that work, and sort of what are the prospects of maybe seeing that expand in Kansas?
Well, as you know, Mark, I've long been a fan of E-Verify, and as the Attorney General, I have the ability to enforce E-Verify within my own agency. The other agency that has E-Verify in Kansas is the Secretary of State's office, which I brought into it. Yeah, I used to have that one. There have been bills that have been run in the Kansas legislature repeatedly to require, at a minimum, all recipients of government contracts use E-Verify, or at least government agencies use E-Verify. Ideally, it would be a much broader bill requiring all businesses to use E-Verify, like so many states have done for years and are doing successfully. It's very easy. But those bills have failed every time in almost every case because the Kansas Chamber of Commerce comes in, or some of their allies come in, like the Kansas Livestock Association, and do everything they can to crush the bill. So we have not gotten that passed yet in Kansas, which is really unfortunate because it's about protecting our U.S. citizens, workers, and our legal alien workers against unfair competition. And
it would seem like, in a sense, it's almost a gimme to have contractors and state agencies use it. Because that's not, that's not some farmer growing sugar beets or something, or, a guy running some fast food place. And again, they all should have to comply with the law too, but this would seem like politically even kind of a gimme to get that enacted.
Yeah, right. You would think so because it's taxpayer dollars.
Right.
So if you're going to spend taxpayer provided dollars to do a job, build a highway, whatever in the state, you would want those taxpayer dollars to go to U.S. citizens, or at least people here working legally. You wouldn't want those taxpayer dollars to go to people who are breaking federal law by even being here.
Just one little question on the E-Verify thing. In a lot of places, there are states that have passed it, but one of the issues is, are there audits? Do you keep up with making sure that employers are actually using it? In your office with the contractors that you use, is there any kind of ongoing effort that they have to demonstrate that they're actually using it in good faith?
Well, they have to get the contract in the first place. They have to show that they are registered with and using E-Verify.
Right.
And if they want to renew the contract, then we'd look at it again.
Right.
But yeah, it's the E-Verify system. To use it, you have to contract with the federal government, effectively promising that you will use it for every employee. So we rely on the federal arrangement with the employer, to ensure that they continue to use E-Verify with every new employee. But it's certainly possible that people could try to game the system and sign up for E-Verify and then not use it. But we're hopeful that that's not happening.
Right. So, what are your future plans, whether immigration related or just career related? What is Kris Kobach going to be doing in the next few years? Well, first of all, you're up for re-election. Is that correct? At the end of next year?
Yeah, I am. I'm up for re-election in 2026. I'm going to be running for re-election. I really love this job as Attorney General of a state. The job of state attorney general has become so much more important in the last couple decades. Well, maybe since 2008, where you've seen AGs being the last line of defense for the Constitution and for federal law and state law when you have a rogue administration in the White House. We saw this first with the Obama administration, then even worse with the Biden administration. So you have the ability to bring a lawsuit without getting an okay from a governor or the approval of a certain number of legislators. You can move very quickly and can stop illegal actions coming from the White House or coming from an administration more broadly. So I plan to stay here. I'm also the chairman of the Republican Attorney General Association, so I'm leading the Constitution-minded attorney generals across the country. And so there's a lot of really important work to be done. So right now I'm quite happy where I am, and I really feel like this is an important job that needs to be done.
And if you do end up winning re-election and we end up with a Gavin Newsom administration or something like that, your job will be, even more important than it is now, quite frankly, at least on a national level.
Yeah, I think that's fair to say. Yeah, the defensive role that the attorneys general can play when you have a rogue administration in Washington is hard to overstate. I mean, if during the Biden administration, the Republican attorneys general had not been bringing those lawsuits, the situation in so many areas would be so much worse. Before I became attorney general, Texas led a lawsuit to stop the 100-day pause on deportations that Biden announced on his first day in office. There were lawsuits brought, which Kansas signed on to stop the abuse of the parole program, which was turned into a de facto amnesty by the Biden administration. The Remain in Mexico policy, which was improperly canceled, that was fought by red states. So things that, obviously were very bad during the 4 Biden years would have been much, much worse if you hadn't had Republican attorneys general bringing these lawsuits, including the one that I mentioned earlier, the one right at the end of the Biden administration to stop giving Obamacare benefits to illegal aliens. And by the way, those Obamacare benefits average about $3,800 a year.
Wow.
So it's a pretty significant incentive to stay illegally in the United States rather than go back to your home country where there is no subsidy or government support for healthcare, and the level of healthcare itself is far inferior to that in the United States. So, these are really important things that the AGs do when, especially when you have an administration that is trying to, skirt the law. And I'm, that's we're just talking about lawsuits in the immigration field.
Right.
I also brought one of the lawsuits to stop the abuse of Title IX by turning sex discrimination into gender identity discrimination, and in a host of other areas too. So it's really important. But hey, can I mention one more thing,
please,
Mark, that I think on the immigration front?
Yeah.
I recently had a piece published in the Washington Times, and it's something that people who are concerned about immigration should know about. The Boulder terrorist, Mohammed Soleiman, many people may have noticed that he was here on a tourist visa, which expired, so he was illegally in the country, and he was from Egypt. And the thrust of my opinion piece is this is history repeating itself.
Right.
There was another Egyptian who came in on a tourist visa and overstayed his visa and undertook a terrorist attack on a much larger scale. And his name was Mohammed Atta. Came in on a tourist visa, overstayed it, he was the ringleader of the 9/11 cohort. The ease of obtaining these tourist visas and then overstaying them cannot be overstated. And right after 9/11, I was in the U.S. Department of Justice before the creation of the Department of Homeland Security. So we had immigration as part of our portfolio. And as you may remember, I designed the NSEERS program, the National Security Entry Exit Registration Program, which was specifically targeted at that problem of terrorists using tourist visas to get into the United States or other temporary visas, but lots of them use tourist visas, and then just staying as long as they want because they know they can stay with impunity and they will not get caught. Anyway, the NSEERS system basically was a system that sent out a red flag whenever a tourist visa is overstayed, and it focused on about a dozen high-risk countries. So if a person from a high-risk country where terrorism is prevalent overstays a tourist visa, an alert goes out to law enforcement all across America. A warrant goes into the NCIC database. So if that person is pulled over for speeding, which, by the way, Mohammed Atta was pulled over twice before the terrorist attacks for speeding, then the local law enforcement officer will know to arrest the individual and transfer them to federal custody. That program was put into place in 2002. For roughly 6 years, America was much safer because of it. Then what happened? Obama canceled it. And as a result, we don't have the NSEERS system in place right now. Had it been in place, a red flag probably would have gone up when Mohammed Suleiman, another Egyptian tourist visa holder, overstayed his visa. So I think it's time for the Trump administration to put the system back in place. We did it by regulation back in the Ashcroft Justice Department years under President Bush, and they could easily do it right now.
Absolutely. And we'll put the link into the Washington Times piece in the show notes. One thing about the NSEERS system that what it succeeded in doing, I remember reading, was it got lots of people, especially Pakistanis, to leave on their own. There was actually statistics about that. Thousands of them left on their own because they realized that, that the party was over. And that really fits into the administration, the current administration's goal of promoting self-deportation.
Exactly.
So this is definitely a tool that we need to revisit.
No, your memory is good, Mark. There were actually some numbers we had back during the Bush administration on this. 1,500 Pakistanis were detained or arrested briefly because they were illegally in the country due to the NSEERS system, allowed for us to discover those individuals. But we know that 15,000 self-deported. So 10 times that number self-deported. How do we know this? Because the vast majority of them went to Canada, and the Canadian government shared these immigration statistics with us. And so when you enforce the law in a targeted way, like the NSEERS program, the number of self-deportations can be tenfold, and indeed was tenfold the number of actual removals that the government does.
And that's going to be, it's an essential approach if they're going to be actually reducing the current illegal population, any significant number, because there's only so many people ICE can arrest. Even with local police assistance, it's still, there's a limit on that. And so it's got to be mostly coming from people realizing that the danger of staying is greater than just going home, and people doing
That's right.
that. So,
yeah.
Thank you, Kris. Kris Kobach, Attorney General of Kansas, has been involved with the immigration issue for, what is this now? That was 25 years, basically, almost, right?
Just about, yeah.
So I'm looking forward to new news at some point in the future about your role. Hopefully you won't have to be standing in the breach as Attorney General against the Newsom or the AOC administration, but there's plenty of work to do even if that doesn't happen. So appreciate your spending some time with us, and people can follow your work, as it were, at the Attorney General. Kansas Attorney General has a website, right? And you can sign up for updates about what's going on there.
Yeah, that's ag.ks.gov. And then there's also my personal website, which is just kriskobach.com.
Okay, very good. We'll include that in the show notes too. Appreciate it. Thank you very much, Kris. And I'm going to let you get back to the important work of working for the people of Kansas. Thanks a lot.
Thanks. Thank you, Mark. Great speaking with you.
And finally today, a couple of thoughts on the kerfuffle over the weekend. I don't know how many of you followed it, but last week, the president basically exempted from immigration enforcement all farms, restaurants, hotels, and meatpacking plants at the behest of corporate lobbyists. both outside the administration and inside the administration. The Secretary of Agriculture, Brooke Rollins, was one of the key figures in getting Trump to do that. And ICE actually sent out a directive telling ICE agents to just stop, not just raids, but stop investigations even of farms and meat packers and restaurants and hotels. This led to the expected uproar, both from the president's base, but also within his own administration, because the people in charge of immigration enforcement in the administration are serious about doing enforcement. They're not interested in, placating or business interests that want to keep employing cheap, controllable labor, even if it's illegal. So on Monday, that all ended, and ICE is now allowed to enforce the law anywhere. And that's good. And this was a short-lived kind of a hiccup or road bump that isn't going to really have any significant effect in the long run. But it is an important reminder for those of us who are committed to immigration enforcement that the forces, even within the Republican Party, within the president's administration, who are in favor of unlimited immigration and loose enforcement, haven't gone away. They're much less prominent. They don't call the shots anymore, as it were, but when an opportunity arises, they will crop up, almost like kind of weeds growing up through the cracks in a sidewalk. And so it's going to take eternal vigilance, as it were. Eternal vigilance is the price of border control and limits on immigration, because this kind of thing is likely to happen again. The president isn't like, anybody's puppet. He doesn't say whatever he's told to say, but he does have both his very strong pro-enforcement inclinations, which are real and genuine, but also as a businessman who knows all kinds of people in these industries, he has kind of a soft spot for those industries that are employing large numbers of illegals because of the claims that he gives a certain amount of credence to, that there's nothing else they can do and no Americans will do this work, that sort of thing. It's not true. It's objectively false. But it would, to be honest, make life somewhat more difficult for employers in those industries. As I like to say, the goal of government policy is one of two things, at least in this context. Either immigration policy will make it so that workers have to hustle for jobs because there's a lot of competition, a lot of other workers, or that employers will have to hustle for workers because there's not as many of them and the employers are all competing and sort of bidding for the same workers. If government policy is going to be leaning one way or the other, it seems to me that, and this is a normative judgment, you can disagree, but it seems to me it's in the broad national interest that immigration policy be such that employers have to hustle to find workers by paying them more, different benefits, flexible scheduling, whatever it is, that employers have to hustle to find workers rather than workers having to hustle to find jobs. And that perspective is the opposite of many people within the administration, many people in the Republican Party and outside, both. And so the core goal, in a sense, at least with regard to employment-related, labor-related questions, should be an immigration policy that creates a tight labor market wherein workers have more bargaining power and employers have to do a little more to cater to them rather than the other way around. That's it for this week's episode of Parsing Immigration Policy. This is Mark Krikorian. Thanks to our producer, Brian Griffith, for making all of these wires go into the right sockets and the whole thing work. Thanks to you for listening. If your podcast platform allows you to rate or review podcasts, please do so. It helps. And if you have any comments, criticisms, compliments, anything, feel free to just email us at center@cis.org. In the meantime, I hope you tune in next week.